So we've looked at placing drawings in a 3D space, but now let's look at how we can work with actual 3D objects. First, you'll want to open the Library panel. This is where we'll import 3D models and store them. So there are 6 types of 3D files that you can import. I've got an FBX file here that I want to import. To import this model, right-click on the 3D Models folder and then select Import Files. Whenever you import a 3D file, it will give you the option to convert it to FBX format. The advantage of FBX is that it consolidates any separate texture files for the object into one file, so it's less likely that your textures will get disconnected. In this case, it's already in FBX, so I'll skip this. If you have a whole folder of objects you want to use, you can also right-click in the library and choose Open Library. Then we can just grab this whole folder here, and it'll get imported, and we can access all the files inside of it. Now this doesn't actually import all those files yet. Once you select an object and drag it to the stage, you'll see it gets added to the 3D Models folder. This means it's now actually a part of this storyboard project now. Just the 3D Models folder is. But let's back up and look at how I added that object to the stage. So when we drag an object to the stage, we get this message saying a 3D layer was inserted in the shot. The shot will automatically be converted to 3D. And if we click OK, you can see our 3D object has been added to its own layer. But you can see we're running into an issue that's very common. Different 3D programs use different base units for measurement. That means when you import an object created in another program, it might end up looking way too big or too small. We could just use the Layer Transform tool to scale it down, but it's better to make its default size more appropriate before we start doing transformations to it. What we want to do is change the object's scale factor. We can do that by right-clicking on the object and choosing Set Scale Factor. Then if it's too big, we give it a smaller scale factor. Now that's much easier to work with. Now if you find that all the models you're importing seem to have the same problem, you can change the default scale factor that objects automatically get adjusted to when they're imported. You can set a scale factor for this specific project in Storyboard Properties, or you can set it in the Main Program Preferences on the Project tab. Now, after you add a 3D model to your scene, you might find that the textures don't display right, or they might not show up at all, depending on how exactly the model was made and exported from the modeling software. So let me show you different display modes for a 3D object. If you select the layer and right-click, we have the options down here. Shaded will show the object with the textures that it was made with. Flat will show the model's surfaces without the textures on it, so it'll just give you a gray shape. Washed gives the object a subtler low contrast look. Wireframe will show the geometry without any surfaces. Then you have wireframe on shaded and wireframe on flat. Flat is generally a good choice for a storyboard because you don't have to worry about the colors and textures drawing attention away from your drawings. So now that we've got a more reasonably sized object to work with and we have it looking how we want, we need to get it oriented and set its pivot point where we want. For 3D objects, it's generally a good idea to have the pivot at the bottom. Then you can use this button in the tool properties to snap it to the ground plane to easily place it. We'll also position our camera and the other elements of the scene. Now I'm going to adjust the focal length of the camera to match the look that I'm going for. Now, in addition to using the transform tool on the overall object, if we open the 3D graph window that we closed before, we can select the individual sub-objects or nodes that make up the model. Now this model I found is fairly simple and somewhat well organized and labeled. When you're just getting a random model on the internet, it might be much more complicated to find anything in here. But in this case, we can see this turret key node here includes the base of the gun and the gun barrel. So if I select that, I can rotate the gun into a new position. And if I select the base and reposition its pivot, I can also raise and lower the gun. Now you can't animate subnodes, but if you really need to, what you could do is select these nodes, right-click, and choose either Separate Subtree or Separate Subobjects, and that makes a copy of this layer and just hides all the other parts of the model. That's why they turned yellow. And on the other layer, it's hidden the nodes we had selected. Now, since that's a separate layer now, I'm able to position the pivot and then add keyframes. We would just need to make sure that if we want to animate the whole tank moving, we need to do that on the new group folder it created. Next, let's say we're ready to draw the character into the scene. We want them positioned on top of the tank. If we just create a new layer, it's going to place it at the default position in front of the camera. But that's not really where we want it. We want that layer that the character is drawn on to actually be on the tank in 3D space. To do that, we can use this tool, Create Layer on Surface. First of all, in the tool properties, pick the type of layer that you want it to create, vector or bitmap. Then you hover over the scene with this tool, and we get this little red dot. And if you click on a 3D surface, it will create a 2D drawing layer at that point oriented towards your current view. You can use this in either the stage view or the camera view. Since we want this layer oriented towards our camera, I'll do this in the camera view. I'll click on the surface of the tank, and now there's a new layer that's actually that far away from the camera. You may need to adjust it a little, but it basically put it where I wanted. And from there, we can just draw whatever we want as normal. Now, one last thing we haven't talked about may be the most obvious use case for importing 3D models, and that's environments. You'll remember before that we exported the SketchUp environment we built as a Collada DAE file. Well, now let's actually import it. So when we exported it, you can see it saved the textures separately in this folder. So this time we will convert to FBX. It might take a while, but eventually it will be ready. Then let's drag it in. And we're going to need to change the scale factor and adjust its orientation. And we may want to throw it into wireframe mode so we can see through it. And there we have it. Now, if I had wanted to, I could have done this from the beginning and used this to set up our backgrounds in each panel instead of exporting separate 2D images from SketchUp. But I didn't want to have to go through the process of explaining all this 3D stuff so early in the course, and working with all 3D can become more hassle than it's worth. So use these 3D features judiciously. That's it for the 3D features. Now we're ready to use all these tricks to make an animatic. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there.